All right, we're live.
Good. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Finding the Source. I am Pete Carmichael, the director of the Civil War Institute here at Gettysburg College, also a professor in the history department, and I am joined by Ashley Luskey, who is the assistant director of the Civil War Institute. And tonight we have the pleasure of having a conversation with Jonathan Jones. So I'll tell you a little bit about Jonathan before we get started. Jonathan has finished his PhD at Binghamton, SUNY Binghamton, and he is currently at Penn State at the Civil War Center there, where he is the very first postdoc. And so I suspect many of the folks at home don't know what a postdoc is. And so I've never received one, Jonathan. In fact, I've never received any awards at all. I've not going to whine about that. Always neglected, Jonathan. That's what Ashley and we use this, or I use this mostly as therapy. I have an opportunity to complain and whine about all kinds of things in my life. So I got the first shot in here. But my understanding that a postdoc gives Jonathan the opportunity to focus on his dissertation and to turn that dissertation into a book. Now, I will need to put my glasses on here so I can read the title, the tentative title of Jonathan's book. And it is, ready? Opium Slavery, the Civil War Veterans and America's First Opioid Crisis. And I know that he is busy at work, and I'm not going to reveal anything here, but I'm very excited about seeing this manuscript in publication. His, people are always saying, oh man, this stuff is cutting edge. We've never heard this before. And about, I don't know, 75, 80% of the time, that's really not true. We have heard a lot of this stuff before. But in Jonathan's case, there is a lot of original research behind this manuscript and some really innovative and interesting ideas as well. What else am I missing about this postdoc, Jonathan? So you're at Penn State, so I assume you got front row seats to watch Penn State football lose last year.
Yeah, well, I wish. Things have been a little bit different because of COVID. So there's been a lot of remote work and a little bit less football than I would have liked. But so far, I've been really enjoying Penn State. It's great. And the postdoc, like you mentioned, is a really great opportunity for me to just really hone in and focus on fixing up the book manuscript. So it's been a really wonderful opportunity.
Well, Jonathan is slated to come to CWI and to give a talk. We, of course, had to scrap our program last year and this year as well, and we're very disappointed about that. But I think this is appropriate to tell folks that we are going to have a conference, a pseudo conference online, second weekend in June. And as we get closer to that, Ashley and I will divulge some of those details. Now, with this postdoc, are you teaching as well, Jonathan?
No, and I think that's really the exciting sort of the selling point for the postdoc here at the Richard Center is that there's no external duties or obligations. You're just working on that book manuscript, and I've also been working a little bit on some side projects and getting started on book number 2. So once I finish, the first book, that is. Yeah. But yeah, that's really the selling point is having that time and sort of the headspace and the resources to be able to go back and do things that you've wanted to do with your dissertation but weren't able to do. So that's been great.
That is, it's wonderful. And I rarely get that headspace, Jonathan. I'm too busy being an administrator at CWI and having to keep that shop going all the time. I get very little time to think about my scholarship. I want to say though, in all seriousness, it's too bad that you didn't get an opportunity to work with some of Penn State students, because I heard and met Jonathan for the first time. It was about 2 years ago at a fantastic conference on microhistory at Virginia Tech. And Jonathan, you gave a wonderful talk. You know what Jonathan did that might actually get him banned from the academy is he actually looked at people and actually just talked. It was a miracle. You didn't have to prove to everyone that you could read a paper. I was quite impressed by all that. And so he's clearly a natural teacher. And I should note, this is a very exciting news. I didn't realize this. Next fall, Jonathan will be an assistant professor at VMI, Virginia Military Institute. Very envious. You get to wear a uniform.
Yep. Yeah, and I'll get the opportunity to start shaving, which is new for me.
You have I'm to excited. Shave. You have
I do. I
Oh,
get to shave.
you get to shave.
No,
You get to shave.
it's
Yeah.
yeah. We so at BMI we wear uniforms. We abide by military customs, but it's a really unique atmosphere for the students or the cadets. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be headed down there, and I love being in the classroom. So
Yeah.
even though I've enjoyed this year having the opportunity to just really hone in on my manuscript, I'm really excited and eager to get back in the classroom too.
You should be. I spoke down there 2 years ago, and I thought the cadets were fantastic. They are
Absolutely.
just, in all seriousness, many of them are history majors, in part
Mhm.
because they're not worried about, I got to use my history degree and find a job. They're headed
Mhm.
off into the military. So they are serious students and very engaging. And I really enjoyed my time there. So congratulations. Ashley, what do you
Thank
think?
you.
Should I maybe start a uniform code at CWI? Might boost morale a little bit, help discipline?
Well, it depends. If we get to wear Zouave leggings or a uniform of our choice, maybe
Yes.
the bucktails,
Yes.
in a hat, that would be
Yes.
kind of interesting.
Let's mix things. How about that? A little
Yeah.
Zouave. I like the bucktail as well. And yeah, how about some chicken guts on the side of our uniforms as well? Let's just go all out. So, hey, Jonathan, again, man, congratulations. This is
Thank
huge.
you.
What a boon for BMI. You're going to do a wonderful job there. So
Thanks
let's
so
get
much.
things rolling here, Jonathan. And let's just talk a little bit about the kinds of trauma that Civil War soldiers experienced during the war. And we should
Mm.
note that the word trauma was not part of their working vocabulary, as I understand. So if you could just give us some background there, that would be appreciated.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think one of the big things to know, sort of going into this, that Americans of the Civil War generation lacked the same kind of vocabulary that we have to describe mental illness, right? So we're familiar today in 2021 with terms like PTSD, right? But Americans in the Civil War era didn't have access or didn't have these terms in their lexicon. So they describe some of the similar kinds of mentally and physically traumatic things that we would experience today in modern wars, but using different language, right? And so that came up a lot in my research. But sort of just to kind of step back and imagine a Civil War battlefield. I mean, you've got a lot of violence. Violence is really mentally traumatic. You have confused conditions, like imagine sort of the smoke, the noise, the fact that you might die at any moment, or someone that you're intimately connected with, your mess might die. The fact that you might home and your might never get to bury your body or be next to you. These things were all tremendously mentally and emotionally stressful for Civil War soldiers. So they suffered the same kinds of what scholars and more culturally familiar to Americans today, we might call things like PTSD. But anyway, Civil War soldiers suffered from these same kinds of mental illnesses and ailments that modern American soldiers suffer from too. On the flip side of that, there was a lot of physical trauma that came out of the Civil War for soldiers and veterans too. Millions of people came away from the Civil War in bad health, and I think that's really one of the things that in my research I try to point out. Like Civil War, physical injuries and sicknesses didn't evaporate or clear up overnight after men left the army. And so if we think about some of those things, we have amputations. I think are really the classic example of a traumatic, life-changing, and lifelong Civil War injury, but also some of the more unglamorous stuff. Like my favorite Civil War ailment is chronic diarrhea, which is what it sounds like, right? It's an everlasting case of diarrhea that you picked up in the Civil War. And hundreds of thousands of Civil War soldiers went home with this condition, chronic diarrhea, which was unpleasant to talk about back then, and just like it is today. And a lot of doctors didn't think it was a real thing. Like a lot of when veterans would go home, a lot of their relatives, a lot of the local politicians, people responsible for doling out pensions in the North, they didn't believe that ailments like this could really physically debilitate someone who had been like a strapping young man when they went to war, right? So there was a lot of conflict over what got to count as a disability or a form of trauma after the Civil War.
And we should note that there was a lot of disagreement as to how to spell diarrhea. James Robertson at Virginia Tech, who passed away, almost 2 years ago, who's a wonderful scholar and a wonderful man, he kept a record of different spellings of diarrhea. And I heard him speak again just less than a year before he passed. I think he was up to 13 or 17 different variations of how men would spell diarrhea. So they even struggled with that. That's wonderful background for us. And again, as we move forward, I think one of your excellent points is the challenge that soldiers had in being able to find the language to describe what was happening to them. And the challenges also of getting people at home in the medical community to recognize that many of these problems were not internal or related to a man's character, but they were physiological and born out of this violence or born out of the world that they inhabited. I just Ashley and I love to talk about books. Ashley's office is right across from mine. And have you noticed, Ashley, how neat my office is now? And you've come in and seen all my books. You maybe haven't noticed. I was inspired by Ashley.
Workers in there, yeah.
It was true. Thank you for selling me out there, Ashley. It is true. Some student workers and brought order to my life because I'm incapable of doing anything on my own. But her office, I have very much had book envy there for a while. But we like to talk about books. I think Katie Shively's book, Nature's Civil War, which I know that you're very much familiar with, but I can't say enough about the importance of that book. And again, how soldiers in the field and confronting these challenges and recognizing that they had to contend with these challenges very much on their own because the military establishment as well as the medical community didn't quite grasp what was going on. So we're talking about the medical community. I'll sort of slide now over to Ashley because I know that she has some questions relating to that.
Yeah, so before we delve more deeply into the role that opiates played in helping soldiers cope with all of these different things, with disease, with amputation, with severe wound pain, as well as the trauma, the mental trauma, we know that opiates were not brand new during the Civil War. They've been around for a long time. They were being used pretty regularly in 19th century life. Can you kind of give us some background for how opiates were used during the 19th century, by whom, in what circumstances, and kind of what the general perceptions of that use of opiates were, and how that evolved over the course of the century?
Absolutely, yeah. I think one of the really interesting things for me going into the project was to learn just how old and how ubiquitous opiates or opioids have been in like human history. Like I usually don't, as historians, we usually don't sort of sit back and talk about like, big universal statements like that, but it's true. Opiates are some of the world's, like some of humanity's oldest drugs. People have been using them for thousands of years, basically for three things, or three categories of things. One is pain relief. The ancient Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, all the way up to the early republic, the United States. People like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin realized that opiates were powerful painkillers, and they in this time period in the 19th century U.S. that was one of the major uses for or uses of opiates. And actually, it's kind of stunning to think about, even having spent several years researching and writing about this. But basically, there were no other great options for pain relief other than alcohol and opium, right? There was no Tylenol, there was no aspirin. I woke up with a headache this morning and I walked into my bathroom and I took some Aleve, which is like my preferred, like my go-to pain medicine. But it made me think, like, if I was living in Civil War America, I would have had to take some opium for my pain, right? So that's kind of how these medicines were used as painkillers. They were everywhere, right? And people have done, myself included, but some other historians as well, have done sort of statistical samplings about just exactly like how common were opiates in American medicine. And it turns out they were the most widely prescribed medicine of the 19th century US. So they were literally the most common medicines in the century in which the Civil War was fought. Painkillers made up one of the major uses, but as we were just talking about a second ago, diarrheal ailments, all of the different various like sort of gruesome 19th century diseases that we think about causing like bowel complaints, were also treated with opiates. So I mean, we're thinking about everything ranging from, like I said, it's a little squeamish, but the audience has been warned. Everything ranging from chronic diarrhea to anything that would come out of the other end, any condition that would cause you to vomit. So like, cholera, yellow fever, even malaria. These were all sort of diseases that were basically, if a doctor was confronted with a case of these ailments, if it was bad or if it was minor, they would just dole out some opium. The third category of sort of conditions that were treatable by opiates sort of emerged with the Civil War, and this is really interesting. And it was actually not just pain and sort of diarrheal sicknesses, but also anxiety. Civil War soldiers, people that lived in America in the Civil War, everyone suffered from a tremendous amount of anxiety, and opiates calm you down, right? They have mood altering effects. So I've seen a lot of evidence. This is something that I unpack pretty deeply in my book, but not as much in my journal article in the Journal of the Civil War Era, is I've seen a lot of evidence that soldiers would self-medicate with opium and other kinds of opiates simply when they felt like stressed out about the job that they were forced to do in the military. There's this one soldier whose case that I investigated in the journal article and that I unpack a little bit further in my book, a guy named George. He has no last name, so it's just George to me. But he became addicted to opiates by self-medicating every time that he would go into a battle. He was a Confederate soldier, so as the army's geared up to go into a battle, he would take some opium. And his doctors, who later treated him for addiction, noted in their medical notes about this guy George that he described the opium as like calming him down. So it's sort of and these are my words, not his, but it sort of turned him into a super soldier by relieving his anxiety. So all of that is.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, all that is to say that opiates were everywhere. They were the most common medicines in 19th century America, and they were used for a wide variety of things, not just painkillers.
Yeah, and the use of opium or opiates as a calming mechanism for anti-anxiety, that was fairly prevalent among 19th century women before the Civil War, right? And of course, Mary Chestnut, now somewhat famously, is known for self-medicating with opium throughout the war, as well as other women who wrote prominent diaries that we're familiar with. So is there a gendered component to this as well before we even get to the Civil War years?
Bingo. Yeah, absolutely. So the most sort of the archetypical or I guess stereotypical addict or laudanum addict in 19th century America before the Civil War was a well-to-do white woman, somebody like Mary Chestnut, right? Somebody who had who viewed as being sort of like physically weaker, who might have nerves that needed calming by opiates. On the flip side of that, and to sort of give a counterpoint to help explain what I mean here, is that South in 1850 were expected to be able to deal with pain without painkillers. They were expected to be like confident, and they didn't need to rely on substances to get them through the day, right? Even though there was a ton of drinking going on, right? Obviously. But on the flip side of that, women were often prescribed or self-medicated themselves with this particular drug called laudanum, which is a liquid form of opiate. It's basically opium distilled in alcohol. So you can kind of swig it as you would like a liquor, for example. Women often self-medicated with this drug laudanum, and they became dependent on it. So if you read medical journals from basically from the 1820s onward until you get to the Civil War, the 1860s, you see lots of cases of women who became addicted to drugs like laudanum, and doctors would try to come up with different ways to treat them and sort of get them back to the point where they didn't need to take laudanum every day. So that they were much more common before the Civil War than addicted men were. A lot of that changed with the Civil War, though, for various reasons.
Yeah.
And so I guess. Oh, go ahead.
No. Go ahead, John.
And I was just going to circle around to what you kind of opened the question with, Ashley, which is the gendered point. Because of the fact that most Americans who had substance or opioid addictions before the Civil War, because of the fact that most of them were white women, sort of the cultural ideas about white womanhood and about sort of like what well-to-do bourgeois, kind of like middle-class white women should be, became the typical like characteristics of an opium addict. Right. So, for example, one of those big hallmark characteristics, when people thought, opium Addict, or in that day they were called opium eaters usually because most people didn't actually inject with morphine, which wasn't really available yet until after the Civil War. But when people in 1830 America thought opium eater, they thought of someone that was dependent, like they were dependent in the same way that society expected a well-to-do white woman to be. They were physically weak, and so all of these like characteristics, basically, of these idealized characteristics of what elite, like middling white women should be, sort of bled over into ideas about opiate addiction.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So Jonathan, could you give us a feel for the expectations that were placed upon Northern and Southern men at the very beginning of the war? So in other words, what did it mean to be a man? And then talk a little bit about those challenges, and then, of course, how opiates come in and figure into this storyline.
This is where I spent a lot of time in my research grappling with this particular question. How did ideas about how male Civil War soldiers and veterans should behave, like how did society's expectations for them as men play out when they got addicted to opiates? Like how did those two things interact with each other? Because on the one hand, society expected, Civil War veterans to behave in certain ways, but on the other hand, opiates made it impossible for them to live up to those standards, right? So basically, think about pain, for example. In the Civil War generation, it was expected that white men were able to, and we can talk more about the racial component of this too, because that's something that's definitely worth diving into. But to take white male Civil War soldiers, the majority of Civil War armies, as our starting point, they were expected to be able to deal with pain without needing painkillers. And this sounds kind of crazy to us coming from a modern mindset where we think about pain as something that can be medically treated. In Civil War armies, if you were over reliant on painkillers, like if you were in the hospital, you had been shot and you were screaming out and you were like, "Give me the morphine," other men would look at you and think that you were weak. You were supposed to grit up and bear the pain, but instead here you are asking for morphine. And so I found dozens and dozens of cases like this where men are in the hospital and they're asking for painkillers, and because of that, because they're looking for medicines to treat the pain, they're seen as less than manly.
Johnson, before and then I know you want to move on to this point, I'm curious, so if you noticed any change over time in that attitude, because it seems to me that certainly there was surprise and shock when men were incapable of maintaining that stoicism when confronted with overwhelming pain. But it seems to me that reality should have eventually kicked in when, in fact, everyone, whether you're in the ranks or in a hospital, saw that these wounds were not just gruesome, but they were excruciating. Did you notice over time that men are like, hey, wait a minute, if someone is screaming out in pain, well, there's good just cause for that. So did you notice any change, or did that cultural expectation weather the storm, so to speak?
I did notice a lot of change, especially among actual Civil War soldiers and veterans, not so much among doctors who were responsible for caring for them, or men and women who did not actively participate in the fighting itself. But among Civil War soldiers and veterans, eventually it got to the point where around the second half of the war, and then moving forward into the Gilded Age, where Civil War Civil War veterans ended up having a lot of sympathy for their fellow veterans who suffered from pain, right? And you can see this play out in other areas of life for veterans too. Like in the 1880s and 1890s, there were big debates in the North, in the US, over the US pension system. Like how liberal should it be? How many benefits should it give out to wounded Civil War veterans? And eventually veterans groups lobbied that the pension system needed to get bigger and pay out more, in part because of pain. They were like, there's a lot of us in pain. We need money. We need to be compensated for that, right? And so the same kind of rhetoric carried over to physical pain and opioid addiction. Right. Every once in a while, I will, as I read through sort of late 19th century newspapers, I find obituaries, right, where a Civil War veteran will have overdosed to death on morphine or laudanum, right? And his comrades or his former army buddies will write an obituary saying, yes, he was a slave to the opium habit, which is usually how they would describe this, right. But He suffered a lot of pain, so we understand that, right? On the flip side of that, if you look at the commentary that people wrote, doctors and other like bureaucrats wrote about pension decisions for those same kinds of men. If you read the doctor's notes, basically the doctors didn't understand and didn't really care that much that people were in pain, and that's why they became addicted. All that they really cared about, the doctors, the pension bureau agents really cared about, is that these addicted men didn't live up to society's expectations that they not be addicted, right?
Would you say too that the indifference during the war is that Army surgeons faced tremendous pressure to get men in the field and shouldering a musket, and it seems to me that an expectation that was placed on the surgeons that explains the seeming callousness, and I guess it was callousness, to the suffering of these individual soldiers who clearly were not allowed to control their bodies in so many different ways. But once they entered that tent of a surgeon, they really lost control of it, right? The surgeon was there to find a way to patch that man up and to send him back out to the front.
Jonathan, as a quick follow-up to that too, I mean, even amongst the ranks of Civil War veterans, yes, there were those who definitely had sympathy or empathy for the veterans who, you know, couldn't get control over their opiate addiction or who did overdose, and then that would result in death. Did you ever find, though, that, you know, there were a lot of opiate addictions, but not every soldier was deathly addicted? So even amongst their own ranks, did you find kind of a condescension or I understand that this soldier was experiencing a lot of pain, but we all went through it, and hey, I never got addicted? Did you find that kind of distancing as well and division within the veteran community?
I did, yeah. For all of those veterans who ended up becoming really sympathetic towards people with opiate addictions, there were, you know, just as many guys who did not develop that same kind of sympathy, who had the mentality just like you described, like, I got shot too at Gettysburg. I didn't get addicted to the morphine, so, you know, shame on you, right? And so you see a lot of this, and it's really been sort of a hidden debate that's played out among soldiers. And I'll give you one more example. There's a guy that I write about in my book named Thomas Chaplin, who was a South Carolina planter who, I forget how he was wounded or where he was wounded, but in the Confederate Army during the war, he was like grievously wounded. And then after the war, he went home and started self-medicating for the pain with opium. Well, he would go to a local pharmacy in Charleston to buy his opium. And it turns out that the guy that he was buying it from, the pharmacist, was also a Civil War veteran. And so at one point in their correspondence, and I've sort of read the letters back and forth between these two guys, at one point, the guy who is addicted, the soldier or the veteran Chaplain, says to the pharmacist, please keep giving me morphine. And the pharmacist basically says, no, I'm going to cut you off because you don't need any more morphine. It's been like 20 years since the Civil War. You should have gotten over it, right? And so these kinds of things, thousands of these different arguments happened all over during the Gilded Age. So it was a very complicated situation with a lot of heated emotions.
You know, that actually ties into a question that we just got. Was there a black market for opioids during the Civil War? So when men were cut off, were denied, where did they go, and what were those networks like?
Yeah, this was a really fun question for me to investigate, and I spent a long time sort of diving down a rabbit hole investigating this. So I have actually found that there was a really big, really expensive black market for opiates in the Confederacy, particularly in Richmond. And it gets a little bit complicated because as the Union Army was able to occupy different parts of the South, some sections got cut off from medical supplies, basically. So in some regions, there were no opiates, right? And so your best options were to give somebody in pain whiskey, right? But in other areas like Virginia, for example, because of its proximity to Richmond, and in parts of South Carolina and North Carolina, where there were sort of ports where they could get opium smuggled through the blockade runners, basically, there were opiates, but the price skyrocketed as the Union blockade became more effective, just like we see with other wartime commodities and things that people wanted to buy, right? So at the same time that the price of bread skyrocketed, the prices of medicines also skyrocketed too. I found this one, my favorite black market story, I'll tell you real quick, is at a hospital called Chimborazo in Richmond. And this was like one of the Civil War's biggest, I think it actually was the Civil War's biggest hospital. It was this massive, sprawling, multi-wing hospital complex where tens of thousands of Confederate soldiers ended up getting shipped to for, at various points during the war. They had a big, in Chimborazo, they had a big medicine shop where they would take like mortars and pestles. It's always a hard word for me to say, and like compound up different concoctions out of medical ingredients. And a lot of those concoctions involved opium. So the point is that there was ready access for the people that were making the medicines in Chimborazo to get opiates. Some of them would steal it and sell it on the black market in Richmond. And at one point in 1864, according to the Richmond Sentinel, that is, which is one of the newspapers in the city, there was a leak in the drug shop at Chimborazo, right? So the city police discovered that the Confederate hospital stewards working in Chimborazo were taking all the opium. Instead of giving it to the soldiers, they were selling it on the street. So I'd love to know. I wish I could find out more about how much they actually got for it, but it was a lot. They made some money doing this.
Well, I actually used to work at Richmond National Park and worked at the
really?
headquarters at Chimborazo. Yeah,
I did.
Actually,
Yeah.
Did you know that story?
I didn't know about the leak in the supply, but I did know about how frequently it was used. And I actually, one of my favorite tours that I used to give of downtown Richmond, Civil War Richmond, near the end of the time that I spent there as a park ranger, was what some of my colleagues and I joked was the red light tour of Civil War Richmond. But it was through some of the neighborhoods that trafficked in opium and that you would see come up in the newspapers time and time again, different busts for alcohol, for gambling, for opium, different names that were given to these places like Screamers Town and I forget what some of the other ones were, but places where basically the night watchmen feared to go, is what one of the newspapers called it, because of all of the sin going on in these dens of prostitution and drugs and drinking and gambling. But when you combine all of those, it was fascinating. And for me, the thing that I always tried to stress to people on the tour was how this was considered to be a true threat to masculinity, to soldiers who are recuperating, of course, in the city, to those thousands of Confederate soldiers who pass through, to, politicians or businessmen who are passing through. It distracts them from, their real, goal, which is to, get back and rejoin the war effort and join the front lines. But also that this would emasculate them, that they would become too reliant on the arms of prostitutes and the alcohol and the opium, and the gambling and the faro parlors and all of that. And that gendered component was huge, which of course ties right into the arguments that you're making in your manuscript about how emasculating and threatening this was to the very underpinnings of Southern society, especially, but also of course to Northern society when gender norms are upended by a drug that becomes so debilitatingly addictive.
So, Jonathan, there is, and Ashley knows Mike Gorman very well. Mike Gorman's also a park ranger at Richmond, and I've not looked at his site, but he has a site dedicated to Civil War Richmond that is truly magnificent in terms of the information that he has accumulated through papers and through other things. And so if you're trying to track down the drug trade, that might, Ashley, wouldn't you agree that might be a good place for anyone to go?
Absolutely,
yeah. Mike Gorman is the master of this site. It's probably called Civil War Richmond. I hope it's that straightforward. Is it?
Yes, it was Civil War Richmond. Now, I do know that unfortunately, this was right before I left the park. Someone hacked into it or some tech glitch happened and the website crashed and he lost a lot of his information. So I'm not sure what the current status of the site is. I know he had a lot of it backed up, but it was a hard blow to him. But yes, I imagine that a lot of it is still there, and it's definitely the go-to place for the most amount of different information and snippets from different newspapers in one place without having to go track down the Dispatch, the Sentinel, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, newspapers are just a really fascinating avenue of like evidence about opiates and the Civil War. Like I didn't expect to turn to newspapers and find as many explicit discussions about drug use as I did, because in general, if you look in soldiers and veterans letters, which are one of the main sources for Civil War historians to research and write about the Civil War, you won't find very many discussions of addiction because it was something that was so taboo that most men tried to cover it up. Like they wouldn't write in their letters, to their wife, hey, I'm addicted to opium. I'm telling you this. Like this was something that they tried to conceal, and also they tried to hide it from anybody that might testify in a pension case, right? So they didn't want people to know. On the flip side of that, you see a lot of discussion both during the Civil War and increasingly in the late 19th century all the way up to the year 1900. You see a lot of discussion of drug use in newspapers. So I've newspapers, even like, websites like newspapers.com have been total gold mines for me. Digitization is great. I've really been able to do a lot more with this project because of digitization than I would have thought than I thought I would be able to do going into it.
Jonathan, this is just one other example how it's so easy for the younger generation. So back in the day, we actually had to leave our homes and leave our computers.
Right.
So it wasn't even internet, right? We had to actually go into archives and look at things, touch things.
Again, and here I am working from home.
How many wines am I up to now, Ashley? I think this is number 3, and I get cut off at 5, so I get 2 more here. So, Jonathan, I have a question. I agree that this issue of addiction is something that soldiers were not quick to admit to, particularly in private letters. And I think that your case that you make about that the idea of manliness was to endure pain, and in fact, pain was or I should say suffering was an opportunity among Victorian Americans, Northern and Southern, to prove one's character. But I want to use that as a jump off point and have you again comment on this assumption or observation. Is it possible that the cultural assumptions of manliness and suffering, that they were felt so strongly and acted upon with I think such determination, that they did not feel pain the way that we feel pain, that they as a people were not as prone to addiction because they inhabited a world that felt differently, right? Felt pain differently. So can the cultural ideas actually, it'd be a hard thing to prove, I recognize that, but can it make them literally feel differently? Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yeah, and this is a big debate among historians, both I guess war historians and also medical historians. Like, to what extent do modern ideas about things like pain and also modern like diagnostic labels, like for example the label post-traumatic stress disorder, to what extent did those exist in the past? I think we oftentimes assume that the human body is the human body, so it hasn't changed over time, right? And this can get really, really complicated, but there are like some historians who think that because, and I won't tell you how I feel about this just yet, but just to sort of lay the arguments out there. A lot of historians think that because, like you mentioned, in 1800s America, suffering was a chance to show your character, right? Like enduring suffering was something to be applauded and lauded. It wasn't something to be to necessarily be exclusively sad about, right? And so with that in mind, it raises the question, like, would, if suffering was glorified, if suffering was good, then would they have actually felt the same sorts of things that we feel when we suffer? Like if a loved one, for example, in the Civil War, would the relatives who survived have felt the same kinds of pain that we might feel when our loved ones die, right? And so this is really complicated, and it's a big debate. But I think if you apply medical history to this lens, it gives a little bit of clarity here. And so this is kind of where I'll dive back into opioids. So I like sort of buy into a school of medical history called medical realism, which obviously medical ideas are what we call culturally constructed. Like medicine isn't just medicine. There's also a lot of cultural baggage attached to it, right? And so what pain means to me is going to be, and basically what I'm saying is that what pain means to me is going to mean something different to a Civil War soldier in 1865, right? But with that said, the feeling of pain itself, like the physical sensation of pain itself, just because ideas about pain are culturally constructed, that doesn't mean that the physical sensation of pain necessarily changes in that 150-year window, is basically kind of what I'm getting at. So I do think that there is something to be said for the fact that the mentality that the Civil War generation had about suffering might have helped them to cope with it differently than we would. But I also think that there were real, like, well documented kinds of suffering, and it's also well documented that the Civil War generation didn't necessarily, like, not all members of the Civil War generation loved to suffer, right? And I'll give you an example, and this is from a book by the historian Diane Miller Somerville. It's on suicide and civil Confederate veterans. A lot of Civil War soldiers, as a lot of, as you both know, and a lot of our audience I'm sure knows as well, went to war expecting it to be like a test where they could prove their manhood, right? And so a lot of soldiers, like, greeted battle and they were excited about it. They were happy to be going to battle, right? And some of that changed over the course of the Civil War because it got so bloody. But at the beginning of the Civil War, not all Civil War soldiers were excited about going to battle. Some men, for example, in Diane's book, she tells the story of a Confederate soldier who was so stressed out about the prospect of going to battle that even before he shipped out to the battlefield, like in a Confederate training camp, he killed himself by taking an overdose of laudanum because he worried about failing the test of manhood. So to sort of circle back around, the point that I'm making is that even though there's a lot, I think, in my opinion, to be said for the fact that the mentality that the Victorian mentality about suffering might have helped shield or insulate them a little bit from the suffering, clearly a lot of people also did suffer and were not insulated from that suffering by their mindset. I hope that's clear. Sometimes I kind of ramble about this.
No, you didn't ramble at all, actually. It's
okay.
Jonathan, I just want to note that Diane Somerville was your dissertation advisor at Binghamton, and it's nice to give her a shout out. Actually, sometimes people do that. They acknowledge their mentors they've had in graduate school. Just want to point that out to you, Ashley. Just file that away if you don't mind.
I acknowledge you plenty.
Jonathan, no, I think that's a very good point, and I think Diane has written a very important book, and I think a book that I think where there's some interpretive tension is Francis Clark's book, War Stories, and I think that that's also very good. They're both books that, for those in our audience who are interested in the soldier experience and who should, I believe, come at it from a cultural angle, those two books would be very useful. I know we have some things to talk about the post-war period and more about the pensions, but I'm going to give you a question here that will require a little bit of imagination on your part, John. Yeah. Being at Gettysburg, Ashley and I give tours all the time. And Jonathan, if you haven't had a chance, you should look up Ashley's tour of Iverson's Brigade, which is, to me, it demonstrates all that one can do on a battlefield. That still includes the tactics, but also makes important cultural connections without, of course, I think, losing sight of, again, the battle itself. And so, Jonathan, I'd like for you to give us some ideas about what we might do on the battlefield, and for our listeners, viewers, what they might imagine when they're on the battlefield. So, Jonathan, we're about ready to describe the beginning of an attack, and we're looking down the line of a Confederate regiment. Tell us, what do you think you'd see some of the men doing right on the cusp of battle?
Yeah, I think so. So this is so to me, when you ask a question like that, it sort of reminds me of a lot of the Civil War movies that I grew up watching. Like, a lot of my interest in history comes from tours that I would take at battlefields and Civil War movies, right? So this is a great question, and I'm really excited about the chance to answer it. I think if you were to sort of step back and take a tour of the moment right before a Civil War battlefield like Gettysburg happens, what I would encourage people to do is sort of imagine, like, looking down the line of soldiers, like, geared up and in formation and ready to start marching. you're going to see a lot of people who have, hardened faces. They're used to it. They're veterans. They fought 3 years worth of war already. They think that they can like whip the Union Army, right? But if you look close, you're also going to see a lot of people that are stressed out and terrified about what's about to happen. And I think that that's something that I would encourage people on a battlefield tour to imagine. For example, the guy that I mentioned, the case that I mentioned a little while earlier, the guy named George, the Confederate veteran who would take opium pills every time that he would go into a battle. You might imagine that George is there somewhere, just behind the formation, taking a quick opium pill before he gets in line with his comrades. You might also notice the surgeons getting ready to cut some limbs off, right? To put it grotesquely, but I would also say, take a look at the medical preparations that are being made for the battles, because the Civil War was a tremendous health crisis. It was like a health fiasco that America had never experienced before, and the military. The medical systems in the United States were not at all prepared to deal in any way with the huge influx of wounds and disease that came out of these Civil War battles. Surgeons, that's not to say that surgeons, all doctors in Civil War armies were called surgeons, but that's not to say that the surgeons didn't try. So right before a battle, you might see, and I write about this a little bit in my book, you might see surgeons laying out their instruments, laying out a workspace for them to conduct surgeries. You might see people on the northern side of things in the Union Army, you might see people preparing ambulances to be able to go and retrieve people and bring them back to the field hospitals. So, take a look at the men. Some of them are stressed out. Some of them might be taking opium. Take a look at the surgeons who might be preparing.
Too. No, and drinking.
Yeah, and drinking.
A lot of drinking.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A lot of drinking.
Totally.
That variance, I think, is so important that you described, Jonathan. The facial expressions, the posture, even if they're not feeling completely stoic, they've certainly got to put up that face for comrades, for commanders. Some of these men would get rip-roaring drunk. Some of them would be marching in, with the point of a sword, a saber by their captain, who is, not so sure that they're going to, stick to the lines during the height of battle. And some of these men, of course, to get back to the chronic diarrhea theme, would literally defecate themselves out of fear. And that terror, that sheer, again, trauma, which they didn't use that word, but that's what a lot of them are going through, certainly, right as they step off the line.
It's a great juxtaposition, what you two have described, to the North Carolina monument here at Gettysburg. And that does not take away from the fact that there were, of course, scores of men who did face the front stoically. I want to give you, Jonathan, a quick anecdote that just I remember from one of my favorite books, Edward Porter's personal memoir, published as Fighting for the Confederacy. And he mentioned prior to Pickett's charge that he spotted, I believe, Mississippi soldiers, but he saw two men that he thought were rifling through the personal effects of a dead comrade. And Alexander rode over to these two men, and he said that he was going to bring them up on charges. And these two men protested. They said that this man was not dead, that he was the surgeon, and that he was drunk, and that he had done this time and time again, and they were taking his implements, right? His toolkit, so to speak. And so Alexander said that he got everyone's names down. And that, of course, after the campaign, he eventually did get it to a court-martial. And here's where your story comes in. I'm going to be curious in your thoughts on this. He said that in the meantime, Alexander said, in the meantime, that this doctor clearly had some friends in somewhat powerful places. And that these men, these two soldiers, someone got to them. And so when it came to the court-martial, their testimony changed. They no longer said that this surgeon was drunk. Rather, they said he was strung out on an opiate. And the doctor got off. He was not convicted. I find that fascinating. And again, Alexander, if I recall this correctly, does not give any other analysis as to why that was a legitimate excuse. Do you have any thoughts about that at all?
This actually happened. I don't know about this specific anecdote, but there were several instances, in fact, where surgeons would sort of deal with surgeons were intimately familiar with the effects of opium and morphine and laudanum, right? They knew that if they took some opium, they might be better able to deal with the stress of like having to saw people's arms off and deal with all kinds of gruesome injuries and stuff like that, right? So there were several cases in the Union Army, and I assume also in the Confederate Army, although it's a little bit harder to tell because a lot of the records were destroyed. But there were several cases where surgeons were court-martialed because they had become addicted to opiates, and they were using those medicines they were either stealing those medicines from the soldiers, and that's why they got court-martialed, or because they were using those medicines to sort of like numb their senses, and that was unmanly. But yeah, this
the doctor gets off, right? I mean, the successful plea is he was on an opiate, and they're like, okay, he's fine, and they didn't convict him because of it. I'll make sure I'll remember to do this. I'll send you the page number from Fighting for the Confederacy. And again, I believe this occurred right before Pickett's charge.
Yeah, and I'll also add there were lots of examples of people who claimed that they accidentally took opiates. So this was also like sort of a common trope that you find in newspapers. It was a common, like something that anybody reading a newspaper in 1860s America would have known that, sometimes people have accidents and they accidentally take too much opium, and that makes them act weird. So this was like it would have been familiar to people reading the account, basically. But yeah, I'll have to look this up. This is great stuff.
Yeah, I'll absolutely say there's no court-martial records, unfortunately, but there's just Alexander's in.
Jonathan, I want to go back to the relationship between the surgeon or the doctor and the patient. Surgeons and doctors, they understood the power of these opiates. They also understood that there was an addictive quality to them, as did a lot of the general public at the time in the 19th century. Would you describe it as a contradictory consciousness or even a false consciousness that these people who knew the medical link between opiate and addiction and then the debilitating effects would then go and blame entirely the user themselves instead of the prescriber? And then the prescriber, being the doctor or the surgeon, would kind of distance themselves from the fact that they were so intimately involved with making this addiction possible. How did they justify that?
There was you point out a really great tension, like a really great observation about the tension that's happening here. Because on the one hand, doctors knew that opiates were addictive, right? So it was no secret, and it was actually common knowledge in both American medicine and American culture going into the Civil War that if you took opium or morphine or laudanum for a few weeks, you were going to need it afterward. And the more that you took it, the more of an opium slave you are going to become, right? So it was no surprise to doctors after the Civil War that a bunch of Civil War veterans came home and were addicted to opiates. And you see a lot of discussion about this in medical journals published from the 1860s onward through the 1890s, and also like the minutes of doctors had conferences, kind of like historians do today, where they got together and discussed the key issues of whatever year it was. And so if you look at the meetings, the minutes that survived from these meetings, which were usually published, you can read that there were like active arguments at medical conferences about the medical profession's role, doctors' role in causing addiction. So there was a ton of debate about this. On the one hand, a lot of doctors felt that it was their fault, and they admitted that blame, and they said, we've got to do better, we've got to change things. On the other hand, there were doctors who victim blamed veterans. Basically, they stubbornly refused to accept any kind of blame whatsoever for causing their patients to become addicted. I think the reason for that is that they subscribed to these ideas about like how men should ideally behave, right? Like doctors. Most doctors, for example, in this time period were like middle and upper class white men. And so they came at the problem from that perspective. They believed that when they came at it from that mindset, that it's almost like they couldn't help but believe that it was the fault of the addicted person.
So it was kind of an instance where the cultural prism through which they're viewing the addiction is stronger than the medical knowledge of scientific fact that the addiction is there, and people largely can't help it when they become so addicted to the point that some of these veterans did.
Absolutely. Yeah. And on the other hand, you do have a lot of doctors, and the number of them and their prominence in medicine in America, like in hospitals and medical societies and colleges, increases as you get towards the 1870s and 1880s. But a lot of doctors in the Civil War generation like cut their teeth on like learned how to do medicine by operating on Civil War soldiers. So this was like a really formative experience for a whole generation of American doctors. And those are the doctors, in particular, the doctors who had never practiced medicine before the Civil War, but were like a brand new doctor between 1861 and 1865. Those are the men who were more sympathetic towards addicted people than their older colleagues, the older guys at the medical conferences. So there was, in particular, I think there's an age element here too, or I guess an experiential element.
Yeah, experience, because as Jonathan, you point out, the surgeons that remain behind the lines, and I think the one that stands out is Mitchell Weir. Is that his name?
Yeah, S. Weir Mitchell, Silas Weir Mitchell.
S. Weir Mitchell. I knew I was getting something off there. That man's kind of a piece of work. I mean, he's fascinating, and at the same time, his ideas, from our perspective, are just truly lethal and barbaric. But he never made that adjustment. He didn't have any sympathy toward, really, it seems like, the patients, regardless of the situation, right? Especially toward those men who were suffering from trauma. Some of the experiments that they did on men who they believed were malingers, including shock treatments, which a lot of people don't realize they did that even during the war as well. Ashley, do we have any other questions that have come in? If not, I have.
We do.
Let's do a few of those before we say goodbye to Jonathan here.
Yeah, sure.
I'll let you go here with those.
So we had a question about apart from self-medication for the use of opiates during the 19th century, was there use recreationally at all that you have found? Or is that really a more modern phenomenon?
This is a fun question. So it's yes, there was. To be, the short version of the answer is yeah, there was. Some people used opiates specifically to get for no medical reason. They weren't in pain. They weren't suffering from diarrhea. They specifically wanted that feeling of, they wanted to know what it felt like when you took opium, right? And so I think that's only natural for people that read about opium. They read about it in the newspapers. They knew that it was medicine. They wanted to know what it did. Here's the trick, though, and here's where it gets complicated. So the short version of the answer is yes, there was some recreational use. The vast majority of it, though, was medicinal. Most people who became addicted started off getting prescribed or purchasing over-the-counter opiates, and that's how they sort of descended into opium slavery. But on the other hand, those people who just wanted to know what it felt like, this is really interesting. There were no laws in the United States at that time that said that regulated narcotics. Yeah. So strictly speaking, there were no laws that said that you couldn't just go out, buy some morphine and swig it just to see what it feels like, right? It was a very, I think of it as like being like the medical Wild West. Anything goes. If you want a medicine, and you want to take it just to know sort of what it does, you can do it, and there's no one there to stop you. And it wasn't until the progressive era when you start to see regulations that prohibit people from freely buying and consuming opioids. But with that said, can there really, I mean, it's kind of a technicality here, but can there really be recreational use if there's no law prohibiting it? I don't know. I think that's kind of an open question among historians of drugs. Like, where does that line, where is that line? Like, where does drug use become licit versus illicit? Right. It's an open question. I wish I had a good answer.
A related question that also came to my mind when I was reading your article is the effects of alcoholism versus the effects of opiate addiction. Was the use of opiates and the addiction to opiates considered far worse, more sinister, culturally more deviant than an addiction to alcohol? And that kind of links into the title of your piece, Opium Slavery. I mean, the fact that the word slavery was associated with this drug, we don't really see that as much. We don't really see like a slave to the bottle or a slave to alcohol, quite as much, or the shackles, that's a very loaded term, slavery, that would have meant very specific things to 19th century Americans. That seems to imply a more sinister, kind of morally deviant addiction than your standard alcoholism. So if you could kind of comment on the differences between the two and the perceptions of them, and then also tie in how race does play into the notion of opiate addiction.
Totally, yeah, and I'm glad that you asked. So, Americans in the 19th century drank so much more than Americans in the 20th or the 21st century, right? And so alcoholism, and even under that label, alcoholism, doctors did occasionally use that label too in the 19th century, was rampant. I mean, it was just everywhere. I think basically that kind of, even though there were these massive debates over temperance, the temperance movement, right? This was a major cultural force in the 19th century, the movement to ban alcohol because it theoretically is causing like social problems, right? Even though that was going on during the same time period, I do think that the pervasive use of alcohol kind of numbed people to it in a way that made them think that it was less bad than opiate addiction. So opiate addiction was common, but it wasn't nearly as common as alcohol addiction. And I think that the fact that it wasn't being addicted to morphine wasn't just your garden variety addiction to whiskey. I think that kind of made it feel worse or seem worse to people because it was more rare, if that makes sense. But you also see, the other reason that I think people thought of opiate addiction as being sort of worse than alcohol addiction is because of the fact that they lacked clear medical language to describe opiate addiction. They described alcohol abuse as intemperance, right? And that was something that people knew and understood back in the 19th century. If you said the word intemperance, you kind of knew what you were talking about. But on the flip side of that, the fact that you could become addicted to a medicine that a doctor gave you, even though they recognized it, they didn't have the language to put that into words. And so what they settled on were these analogies with slavery. So if you read about opiate addiction in 19th century newspapers or medical journals, or even the rare letter that you might find where a Civil War veteran writes about his own opiate addiction, they describe themselves as, or they describe it as a slavery to opium. I am an opium slave is what people write. And so that the fact that they lacked other language and they had to draw on the slavery motif, I think made it so much more worse than alcohol addiction in their mindset. Because like you said, the word slavery was a loaded term in 19th century America. There was a lot of cultural baggage that went along with that.
Sure. And how exactly does that kind of undermine whiteness, the idea of being a slave to opium? What kind of ethnic and racial implications specifically are you talking about? Because it's not just, the standard, African Americans, Black people, are not in control of themselves versus whites who are in control and, independent and, self-reliant. There are other groups, the Chinese, most especially after the Civil War, who, this is linked to opiate addiction amongst the Chinese, and that has certain, racial and then ethnic implications as well. Can you go into that a little bit as well?
Totally, yeah. So there's a couple of things to unpack, but I think the thing that's been the most on my mind lately is how opiate addiction among white Civil War veterans and also Chinese immigrants, for example, opium smoking, played into emerging ideas about what was called race science, which were these sort of in the Gilded Age after the Civil War, from like the 1870s until the 1910s. American doctors were hard at work, basically trying to prove that white Americans were biologically superior to other Americans, right? And so opiate addiction played into that. If the common knowledge was that if somebody was addicted to opium, they were an opium slave. So when you use that word slave, it conjured up like images of non-white people, right? But also when you think about Chinese opium smokers who increasingly, this was like widely covered in the press after the Civil War, when you have a bunch of white Civil War veterans who had like a special place in American society. A lot of people held them up as being like the ideal man, right? Like they had a platform, basically, is kind of what I'm trying to say. They had a special place in society. When you have those same groups of people suffering from the same problem that Chinese immigrants, for example, were suffering from, and you also have doctors saying that one group is supposedly genetically superior to the other group, that just didn't mesh very well. That confused things. And it actually made doctors really worried about the future of the US. One of the main things that the people that were developing this theory, like these racial scientific theories, were getting at is that they were trying to prove that the U.S. Because white Americans were theoretically superior to non-white Americans, the U.S. could go out and conquer the world, right? Could create an empire. And so if you had a bunch of white men suffering from the same kinds of problems that non-white populations abroad were suffering from, that sort of hollowed out the claim that Americans were better than other people, right? And so it undercut doctors' arguments basically that Americans were, or white Americans were genetically like better than others. It gets really complicated, but it also hurt Civil War veterans, white Civil War veterans' ability to say that that they were white and therefore they were better than others too. And it complicated everything.
Yeah, Jonathan, it's an outstanding answer, and I think a good place for us to conclude tonight's conversation, and to remind everyone that this is a book that Jonathan is putting the finishing touches on, and the process of publishing a book, and unfortunately it's not like flipping a light switch. So it's my hope that we'll see Jonathan's book in print in a year, or a little bit more than a year. And as I said to you all at the beginning, you can tell this is the kind of original research and original thinking about the Civil War that we don't often see. So it's really exciting. And also to note, starting at VMI in the fall, Jonathan, I'll speak for Ashley here, but we want you to bring the cadets up to Gettysburg. Ashley and I would love to take them around the battlefield, and we'd love to have them come up. And Jonathan, I know that you're going to be your first year at VMI, and everyone, I think, probably in our audience also knows that first-year cadets are called rats. And I suspect there must be some kind of category for first-year professors. And I know they don't haze people anymore. But Jonathan, I'm just curious.
Right.
I'm curious what you're going to go through, and if you need some allies, I know Ashley and we love Lexington, and so we're happy to come down, and in case you're being bullied or picked on, we'll stand up for you.
I will take you up on that, absolutely, and on your offer to give the cadets a tour, absolutely. That's great.
You know what? They're so fortunate to have you. You're going to love the students.
Thank you.
I think it's going to be really great for you and great for them as well. Ashley and I have one quick announcement. Ashley and I just love being on Zoom programs so much that tomorrow we're up again, but we're not doing a Finding the Source, rather doing a program called Fighting Words, the American Civil War and the Polarization of American Politics. I think Ashley and I have talked about this with our two other panelists, Michael Berkner at Gettysburg College and Jim Downs, who's his first year here at Gettysburg. So it'll be the four of us. I think that all of us are somewhat mystified that many of our peers are making some curious leaps and connections between the political situation today and the Civil War past. Not to say that there are not questions and parallels between the two eras, but for those of you who are looking to talk and to hear about some history and to think about politics today, we're doing that tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. The best way to find us is just Google Gettysburg College Fighting Words. It'll come up, and you actually have to register for tomorrow's conversation. So 7 o'clock tomorrow night. And Ashley, thank you so much. Good seeing you. I'll see Ashley tomorrow night in person. Actually, we're not going to be doing it on Zoom. We're going to be all together, socially distanced, of course, but
with our masks on.
We'll have our mask on. Yep. But this went really well. It was a nice fluid conversation. Sometimes it's hard with Zoom, as we all know. You just disrupt people, but it's going to be a nice change of pace tomorrow. We'll all be in the same room, looking at the same camera, and again, having a conversation. The audience, we encourage them to send in their questions. So there'll be lots to think about tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. Jonathan, again, thank you so much. Ashley, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me. This was a blast. Thank you.
Yeah, you did. It's wonderful.
Man. And hopefully third time's the charm. We had you scheduled for last year for CWI, this year for CWI. Hopefully the next time we can definitely get you down here for a live talk.
Absolutely. Third time's the charm.
We want you to talk about what you did at Virginia Tech. You gave that great talk on that Confederate. It was fantastic, man. I was really good. So yeah, he's got some other talks in the bullpen that would be good to hear. Oh, but there it is. Hello, Harper. That is little Harper. Hey,
We have a
sweetheart.
visitor. This is my older daughter, Harper.
He's looking a little sleepy.
Apparently needed to say hello.
She wanted to see Uncle Pete, didn't you, Harper?
That's right.
Yeah, I love that. You gotta love that.
Marshmallow Pete for Easter.
Yes, I love Peeps. I'm addicted to Peeps. I'm gonna come over and get some. Harper, save some for me, okay? Oh, yeah. There's the limit of her love. You got to respect that. All right, y'all. Have a wonderful evening. Jonathan, take good care of yourself, buddy. All right.
Thank
Thanks so much.
you.
You too.
Bye,
Thank you.
Harper.
Bye.